Get thee thy Gnostic tarot. And yes, heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it is. It just is. As you come on to Aeon Byte, welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to the machine, my son, and the means to escape it. Welcome, you spiritual entrepreneurs, you veterans of 1,000 psychic wars, and you modern day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent to any god or government. My name is still Miguel Connor, and I am your Pompadour of Gnosis. So happy to see everybody joining on this Mercury day, and we've got an amazing show for us. As always, it is a pleasure and an honor to be joined by an individual that I am honored to call a friend. Will say proudly, I think he is today's greatest philosopher and somebody who has really moved the needle towards Sophia, and that is Jason Reza Jorjani. Jason, thanks for joining once again.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Miguel. And not only do I consider you a friend, I consider you the greatest living Gnostic that I'm very happy to have this dialectical rapport with. And just before we even get started, I've been reading Miguel's book on Elvis, and I tell you, I never thought that I would be so deeply impacted by a book on Elvis of all people. He wasn't exactly within the spectrum of my musical tastes, but it's a great work on the occult in general. The amount of stuff in there on theosophy and very interesting Jungian and sort of Steinerian psychoanalyses of Elvis were deeply insightful in a way that was even, I would say, unsettling to me introspectively. So I would really recommend this book. I'm a hassled person who doesn't have a lot of time to read many things, but it was well worth it, folks.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It means the world to me. And yes, Jason, I do cite Jason's work because obviously, as you know, Jason, the blue light is so important, that blue energy, and your book, Closer Encounters, discusses why the blue light, how it appears from the Black Death to Skinwalker Ranch to all these places, and why UFOs have a blue light. You go very into detail. So that was one of the missing puzzles to really understand Elvis's complexity if we go the UFO extraterrestrial lens, which I do with Elvis too.
There are 3 stunning close encounters that you detail in that book, and all of them, if I remember correctly, were witnessed by other people. He was with other people in Correct. Each instance who
Never
also
saw,
including this blue UFO that was hovering over the house at one point.
Yeah,
but quite a book. I had no idea that Elvis was so deep into various occult traditions and such a seeker, of esoteric spiritual paths.
Yes. And he was a great thinker. He would love being with us and enjoying the internet and all that good stuff. So thank you, Jason. I really appreciate it.
Interesting about the book.
Sure.
And also at the same time, one of the most disturbing things about it is this. You don't come straight out and say this, but your insinuation and suggestion that Elvis might have realized he had a destiny to become some kind of a spiritual leader in America.
Right.
And that through his very eclectic interpretation of the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas, let's say, he could have transitioned from being a rock star into being some kind of a new age spiritual leader that fundamentally reoriented the religious landscape of this country.
Mm-hmm.
And that on some level, he was uncomfortable accepting that responsibility and rejected it through pursuing a path of self-destruction. That was a fascinating suggestion that you made, and intriguing in a really dark way.
Yeah, I think he would have done it. And you see, it really was the women, the maenads, the women tapping into this goddess, Diana, and so forth, Lilith, that those were the ones that supported Elvis. So he could have done it. Jung was the same way, remember? Jung said himself, I have 2 paths. I could become this world-leading guru, or I can just become a therapist. and he chose. He's like, I'm going to go with the science part. I like recording this stuff more than ruling people, but I could rule people if I wanted to. So
yeah, and your whole discussion of the Jungian archetype of destruction as what ultimately, possessed Elvis and destroyed him from within, made me think a lot about the nature of Ahriman, which is something that you mentioned in the book very explicitly. That I forget what his name was. Elvis's
Colonel Parker. He's Ahriman,
sort of publicist manager kind of guy, right? So he's like the Ahriman to Elvis's Lucifer in this very Steinerian setup that you have. And it made me reflect on, the nature of Ahriman as Zarathustra expresses it in the Gathas, and what the relationship is between constriction and constraint, which is what Zarathustra used the term angraminu, which later became Ahriman, to express. Constriction and constraint, and then the death drive, as you're laying it out in Jungian in this book. There's a relationship between those as facets, I think, of the Ahrimanic. So anyway, it's a fascinating work on the occult, not just an excellent biography of Elvis.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I really appreciate it coming from you. And like I said, that means the world. I wanted to show you something else, Jason, when you get out of kick, since we're going to talk about simulation and quantum computational computers and all that. But this is something I showed the other day. Let's see, you can see it. This is a article from science.org. Gravitational waves reveal unprecedented collision of heavy and light black holes. So we have two black holes crashing and they make a sound. And they harmonize the sound. And guess what the sound is? I Can't Help Falling in Love with You by Elvis, the beginning of the song. So, wow. It is. It says here, if the main frequency were a C on a piano, the overtone would be the higher G, a perfect fifth, and the interval of the first two notes of the melody of Presley's hits, I Can't Help Falling in Love with You. So it's right there. You can look it up. So I was like, oh my God, you better watch out, Jason. If you're going up with AI and you go to the top, maybe it won't be Sophia or Satana. Maybe you'll meet Elvis instead at the top of the simulation.
What that makes me think is that maybe they heard this signature first in Atlantis, the same detection that we've made now, that they detected this, and that Elvis, potentially as a reincarnated Atlantean, was anamnetically, subconsciously recollecting that tone and putting it into his music.
Yeah. So interesting stuff, and I'm getting so many other downloads and articles. So we've only just begun, and thank you. And we better introduce somebody who I also considered a very good friend, and that is Graham. Graham, how are you doing today? Are you all shook up?
I'm doing pretty good. I was going to say there's a lot we can learn from Elvis. One thing I would recommend not following with Elvis is nutritional advice.
Yeah, that is true. He did like to eat. He liked Dr. Peppers. So that one I'll follow. I like Dr. Pepper. But
banana and peanut butter,
is a good. Nah. I started eating them, and Graceland and Denver have some very good ones. Don't knock it if you get a good one. They're awesome. Not good for the heart. I
haven't had a good one.
Awesome. Well, let's get started. For everybody, good to see everybody on the chat. We got a big group. Again, if you have any questions for Jason, please super chat them so that we can get to them, and we shall. So let's get to your new book, Jason, Metapolemos. Tell the audience, what is Metapolemos?
So it's a Greek word, and it can be understood in two ways. Sort of more superficial and exoteric understanding of the word is as super war or hyper war, what you might call in German Überkampf. But meta can also mean beyond. And so there's an esoteric sense in which part of what I'm talking about in this book is what lies beyond the cosmic conflict, a dimension of existence that is prior to, more primordial than the combat theater or the deadly game of existence. And we'll get into that and unpack it. But essentially, it involves the idea of Eros and establishing a relationship with the aeon that allows one to understand cosmic conflict as a kind of play or theater, a kind of war game that needs to be played out, but that also occults or occludes a hidden dimension that can only be accessed through an erotic rapport with the wisdom of the aeon.
And how can this help us? And I know I'm asking this because there's a saying that's been going on in my head from Krishna, or the philosophy of the Hindus, that life is a game that must be played and can't be won. Is that what you're saying, or what's your twist on this? We can win, right?
The winning is in the playing of the game. So one of the things that you see in the course of this book is a thoroughgoing critique of utopia and of the projection, psychological projection and social projection of a final perfected and pacified state of society where, okay, the idea of the war to end all wars, all right, we're going to fight this world war, but then there's going to be peace. There's going to be the United Nations international system, the Bretton Woods world order, and it's all going to be good, right? So this notion that you see it in H.G. Wells with the conception of a new world order. You saw it in Karl Marx, that the war for communism is the war to end all wars, and once the power of the bourgeoisie is shattered and the government of the proletariat comes into being, there's going to be world peace and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So this kind of utopianism takes many forms that justifies war in the name of some final end that's going to pacify the world under a single supposedly perfect understanding of the nature of things and a perfectly ordered society in accordance with that. And so I'm critiquing that notion throughout this book, as I have in certain other texts of mine, like Erosophia. And I'm saying that, no, look, if you really understand the nature of existence, first of all, there's no overarching unity that would reconcile all the apparent conflict in the world. So one way in which I would differ from the Hindu statement that you just cited is that typically, from a Vedantic perspective, all of the conflict in the world is a veil of illusion. It's Maya. And sometimes in the more sophisticated forms of Vedantic thought, like, for example, Kashmiri Shaivism, which I studied for a while in my youth, this conflict, this theater, this arena, this Tron, is even explicitly described of as the play of Shakti. So it's not just Maya, but it's a theatrical illusion and described of as a kind of game or play that Shakti, the energetic divine feminine principle, engages in, right? But even in the more sophisticated Kashmir Shaivite version of Vedanta, there's still the notion that underlying this conflict or beyond this conflict, there is a unity of being which is veiled by the Maya, and that the Maya is somehow a secondary, inferior, ignorant misunderstanding of what is actually an eternal, infinite, unified being. Throughout my philosophical work, throughout my corpus, I've tried to repeatedly deconstruct this idea, and especially to attack it from the standpoint of an affirmation of free will, and show how the idea of the unity of being, which we see, in Parmenides, all the way back before Plato and Parmenides in the West, and we see all over the Vedic tradition, this conception of the unity of being is something that precludes free will. And so I've affirmed the position ontologically and further developed a position that you see in Heraclitus, and that Nietzsche explicitly reappropriated. You also see it, interestingly, in William James in his book, A Pluralistic Universe. This conception of existence as co-constituted by a multiplicity of independent forces, of various forms of life that are struggling with one another to come to some kind of a consensus about what reality is. So reality is inherently intersubjective and comes into being through the struggle of various forces and through the perspectival conflict of different forms of life. So there's a psychical battle over the very constitution of the cosmos. And on one level, that's the Metapolemos. The Metapolemos is the cosmos conceived of panpsychically as a war between various forms of life over the constitution of reality itself. And I mean that very literally, in the sense that what we typically in the modern age tend to consider reality is what's framed in the context of theories produced by a particular scientific paradigm. But if you look at the development of scientific paradigms, even over just the last century, Einsteinian relativistic physics doesn't agree with quantum mechanics. There are two paradigms that have hitherto been unreconcilable, and there's people who've come up with things like pasta physics, string theory, which turned out to be a completely bogus mathematical formalism referring to no reality whatsoever in an attempt to reconcile Einsteinian relativistic physics with quantum theory.
I thought the quantum foam, I forgot who did it, that reconciled it. I forgot his name.
There's been like 10 different proposals of how to do this, and none of them are backed by any empirical evidence.
Oh, okay.
What I suggest is this, that this is a completely wrong way to go about working with scientific paradigms. Scientific paradigms are toolkits that have an ultimately practical significance because, as I argue in Metapolemos and I have in other works of mine, technology is ontologically prior to science. Technology in the sense of techne or craft is more primordial, more fundamental than abstract scientific theorization. And the purpose of framing scientific paradigms is to make it possible to do things that we haven't been able to do before.
Right.
So if you want to get rockets to the moon or whatever, you use Einsteinian relativistic physics. If you want to communicate with Mars without having any delay and have basically an instantaneous communication system to Mars or to another star system, you would need some kind of quantum communication system to be developed, and you'd want to work within quantum mechanics as a paradigm. But here's the interesting thing, to go back to Metapolemos, is that if it's in fact the case that scientific paradigms are practical approaches to dealing with the flux that we take to be nature, and the assumptions embedded in those paradigms as kind of what Wittgenstein called the hinge propositions upon which all other propositions hinge, the kind of door hinges of the various paradigms. If those assumptions make different things possible, then as quantum theory suggests to us, our intentionality is shaping the world at a fundamental level.
Of course.
Which means that, as Nietzsche understood, I mean, this is the real ontological meaning of his formulation, the will to power. It wasn't just about political domination or something.
Right.
It's an ontological, epistemological idea. And it's the idea that different forms of life are trying to frame different laws of nature. Individuals and societies have certain assumptions. They have certain hinge propositions. And those hinge propositions can become fundamental to various scientific paradigms. But whether it's a formalized scientific paradigm or whether it's some other kind of dominant, to use the language of Charles Fort talked about dominants that rise and fall in history, which are like networks of assumptions. They're superstructures of belief. So it could be a scientific paradigm or it could be a religious belief system. dominants or paradigms are actually shaping the world ontologically on the level of what we think is naturally possible. And so there are no laws of nature. John Archibald Wheeler was a quantum physicist, argued this very rigorously too. That he basically understood physics as information, and that that matter and energy are actually not just interconvertible with one another, they're different states of information, and that in an informational cosmos, consciousness is prior. Consciousness and its relationship with the flux of dynamic energy is prior to whatever emerge as laws of nature. So these laws of nature are not necessarily permanent or stable, and they themselves may emerge only from out of the intersubjective struggle or perspectival war between different forms of life. So that's part of what I mean by Metapolemos.
No, well said. Whew, that's a lot, but incredibly well said. I think first, what I was in my head, first I thought you talked, the war to end all wars is like, if I hear one more time, it's 2 weeks before Iran has a nuclear bomb. We've been hearing that since I was like 15 years old with the end of the world. These tropes they try to put on us. For the Mars thing, I know it's a little on the side, but I always think, why are we going to Mars? Of course, I go to your book, Closer Encounters, because we want the artifacts. I think that's what the elite really want, right, Jason? They want that technology that's there. They don't want to colonize it. They want the goods,
well,
the treasure.
The people who are living on Mars or under Mars, the surface of Mars, might have something to say about that. So, we'll see. We'll see whether we get our hands on any artifacts.
Yeah, we can colonize that. Well, they're going to try because it's just too delicious. So, and the other thing that reminds me too is, you keep talking about conflict and stress and all that, but your model goes to Heraclitus, but Heraclitus famously said, God is war. So that's what really is. So he was really, I don't know, making sense. You can say this is a universe of tension and conflict, and that's all it. That's it.
Look, there are 3 fragments from Heraclitus that should always be put next to one another. One is this infamous war is father and king of all. Mm-hmm. All things come to pass and are ordained in accordance with conflict. That's one. Another is the aeon, which is referring to the same deity here. Whether you think of it as masculine or feminine, obviously whatever is the supreme intelligence is going to be androgynous or hermaphroditic. Right. So in any case, war is father and king of all. All things come to pass and are ordained in accordance with conflict. That's one fragment. Put it next to this one. The aeon is a child at play, moving pieces in a game. Sovereignty belongs to the child. And then a third one. The hidden harmony is better than the obvious one. So what that last fragment means, when you put it next to the first 2 that I just quoted, is that you shouldn't be working for world peace or be laboring under the delusion that it will ever be possible. And in terms of political theory, this is something that the German legal theorist Carl Schmitt understood very well and argued in his books, the concept of the political and the crisis of parliamentary democracy, and also in his book, Political Theology. He was a big disciple of Heraclitus, Carl Schmitt, and also of Nietzsche. And so you're delusional if you think that your warfare, your economic and industrial policies or whatever are ultimately an effort to pacify the whole world. What you should grasp is the wrong word. What you should establish a relationship with and attempt to understand and be in tune with is a hidden or occulted harmony. There is a dimension of existence beyond polemos or conflict, with which one can resonate and have some kind of an engagement, but not if, like a Hindu, you believe that that's a door to escaping the world and that you're going to get behind the curtain of Maya by doing that in a way that frees you from the domain of strife and suffering. Rather, the aeon behind the curtain, or the wizard in the Wizard of Oz's booth, right, is this entity that is promoting conflict. And why does this entity promote conflict? Not necessarily because she's a sadist, but because life requires evolution. And anytime any structure ossifies into some kind of a stasis that atrophies our capacities and that becomes, how can I put it, stasis that results in degeneration, because there isn't an open horizon of development any longer, and people suffer from a failure of imagination. Nobody dreams of anything different anymore. There ceases to be innovation. Whenever you have an overly structured, stable system like that that's ossified, this entity, the aeon, has to come and shake things up and break things up, like breaking the crust to unleash volcanic lava that can take new forms in the fiery forge of creation. And so that's the reason why this entity plays this war game, engages in this theatrical spectacle, which is, in a sense, in Antonin Artaud's sense, a theater of cruelty, because the game is, to an extent, a war game.
Yeah.
But, as Empedocles, the pre-Socratic thinker Empedocles put it, this Eros, he called it Eros, strife. You could also call it polemos, as I do. This Eros, or strife, on a cosmic level is in a dialectical relationship with, or it's another facet of Eros on a cosmic level. Because the reason why there has to be strife always and polemos has to be perpetuated is because we have to strive to create new things and to innovate. And that striving is ultimately motivated by Eros. So the erotic is the wellspring of creativity. The erotic, conceived of on an ontological level, is the wellspring of creativity. And the relationship between Eros and strife is the motor of the life force and the power of innovation on a cosmic scale.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, or as Ursula Le Guin said, how you play is what you win. And so this would make sense even in the Gnostic myth, Jason, right? Sophia, they say, well, she rebelled against the Pleroma because she was wise. She was like, this system is going to go stale unless there's more iterations and tension and dynamism. So the only way to save or keep things going is for me to rebel, right?
Yeah. Look, there, as we've discussed before, there are a plethora of forms of Gnosticism, some more monistic, many more dualistic. And so, it depends, what you consider the basic structure of the Gnostic myth. One thing that is worth noting is that the dichotomy between power-hungry archons that promote conflict on the one hand, and aeons that are meant to guide you toward a pleroma that's going to be a permanent escape from the domain of conflict on the other hand, is a duality that I've been deconstructing in my work, and a duality that cannot comprehend what it is I mean by Metapolemos. Because the aeon, as I'm conceiving of her in this work, has both aeonic aspects to her and archontic aspects to her. I mean, it is a kind of diabolical intelligence that, diabolos, the word diabolos means to set in conflict or tension, or to basically to bring about dynamic tension. That's the essential meaning of the word diabolos. And which is why also, Prometheus winds up becoming ha-shaitan, becoming the Satan, because Prometheus is causing a conflict with Olympus, is a figure of opposition,
Right.
establishing a dynamic tension, right? And so it's important to realize that this conception of the aeon confounds a lot of the more dualistic dichotomies in various forms of Gnosticism.
No, makes sense. And before Heraclitus, we have Parmenides, who some have said that the entire human history is catching up to his ideas. We're all trying to catch up to his being and becoming ideas, but he went down to meet this goddess. So you think the goddess was the apex predator of the universe? He doesn't name her, but it probably was Satana.
I think he calls her Moira.
He calls her Moira.
Word for like destiny.
Okay.
And they would go down into caves and use psychedelics in order to basically free themselves from the limitations of normal human perception. That was what the Eleatics, the school of Parmenides, did. And again, as I suggested earlier, I think that, like the Vedic sages, Parmenides projected his own psychological need for unity and stability onto what it is that these people experienced when they underwent these psychedelic trips. Gautama Buddha makes a point of this in his, in the Theravada sermons, the long, very philosophically rigorous Theravada sermons of Gautama Buddha. One of the points that's made is never underestimate the human mind's ability to project onto even the most rarefied, subtle states of mind. I mean, subtle perceptions of the nature of the world. So he discusses all these jahanas, or different degrees of the capacity to perceive the complexity of existence. And he says that even sages who are way more penetrating in their power to apprehend the nature of the cosmos than an ordinary person, often from out of their deepest subconscious psychological needs, will project this unity of being onto their experience of, let's say, dependent origination. They will mistake the way in which beings are mutually dependent in their origination for an overarching unity of being, because it satisfies its deep subconscious psychological need. And in accordance with that, Gautama Buddha deconstructs the idea of Brahman and becomes, one of the first atheistic thinkers, not atheistic in the sense they don't recognize there are devas. Yeah, there are gods or archons, whatever, supervillains, superheroes. But atheistic in the sense that he deconstructed what he believed to be delusional projection of any one god, Brahman, or supreme being, unity of existence. And so I would say that Parmenides suffered from the same delusion, and that his followers, who would, the Eleatics, who would go down into these caves and use psychedelics, their psychedelic experience was being conditioned by psychological projections in the end.
Right. No, that makes sense. Let me bring in Graham. How does this sound, and do you have any questions?
I was going to sit there and say, one thing I note is so many people who are in love with Nietzsche have never tried to work through Schopenhauer and his conception of the will, which is very much where Nietzsche gets his ideas from. As far as Jason's ideas, they resonate a lot to me with Hermann Hesse and like the Glass-Beak game, Das Glasperlenspiel. And I was curious, I'm sure he's familiar with it, the parallels in between that and his ideas.
Yeah, well, I make a huge deal of Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf, especially in my novel Psychotron, but then also in reflection on that in Metapolemos. I come back to the idea of the magic theater of cruelty from my novel Psychotron in Metapolemos and offer my own analysis of it, including a kind of, making conscious of what was subconscious when I wrote that novel. And the magic theater of cruelty idea from from Psychotron is a fusion of the magic theater from Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf with the idea of the theater of cruelty from the innovative, drama theory of Antonin Artaud. And okay, so it's worth going into this for a few minutes,
Sure.
very briefly, as concisely as possible. Artaud's idea, and I'll come back around to Hess, Artaud's idea in magic theater, in the theater of cruelty, was to develop a form of drama that obliterated the distinction between the spectators and the spectacle, so that the theatrical performance was no longer a spectacle, which is maybe, as Aristotle thought, intended to produce catharsis in the audience. What goes on the stage is meant to get you in the audience to confront your subconscious, and is meant to elicit you in the performance in a way that makes you realize that life itself is a performance, and that breaks down the distinction between the temporally limited theatrical play and the larger play that we're all ensconced in and engaged in life in general. And he intended to do this through like shocking things that violate the audience's attempt to psychologically separate themselves from what's going on the stage, and also to break through their psychological defenses in a way that disturbs their relationship with other people in the audience, right? And makes them realize that they themselves are actors in a way, engaged in a performance in their everyday lives. So this is the, basically part of what Artaud was on about in terms of theater of cruelty. Hess, go ahead. Yeah, Graham.
Oh, I was going to sit there and say that's interesting, because one of the ideas for Greek theater I always had was they were going for a group catharsis, where they're trying to lead the whole group through that psychological state rather than necessarily any individual. And I see what you're saying, where the next step is to break it into the individuals and the audience and the relationship to each other. Thanks. Just wanted to comment. Tag.
Yes, but and also about that, what you just said is that Nietzsche points out in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, that the original form of Greek drama was very shamanistic in the sense that you're saying. And it was intended to produce a kind of effect on the audience that was akin to a shamanistic ritual. Mm-hmm. But what then catharsis in the context of theatrical theory comes to mean for Aristotle is very different, because Greek theater from the time of Aeschylus, which is what Nietzsche is talking about, early Greek theater, Aeschylus, Euripides, Greek theater evolves in a way where it becomes much more a spectacle that's being put on for an audience at a distance, where the audience is subjectively watching something that's objectively outside themselves. So there's this evolution of theater, and then consequently what it means to undergo catharsis, watching a spectacle outside yourself, becomes something very different than that early shamanic ceremony that, let's say, was going on in, with Aeschylus's Prometheus. In any case, Artaud is intending to kind of really radically deconstruct this altogether and obliterate the distinction between the performance and the lives of the spectators. In Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf, there's this idea of an occulted, hidden magic theater, and in the novel, it's a place that Harry Haller, the protagonist, winds up going, where he's potentially takes psychedelics, and there are these strange people there who, some of whom he knows, who basically initiate him into what goes on in this sort of secret society. But actually, it's a metaphor for the nature of the world and what it means to look behind the curtain of the wizard's booth. So that, once Harry Haller gets there into the magic theater toward the end of Steppenwolf, he sees that all the great geniuses of history are there, especially the great creators like Mozart and Beethoven and the great scientific innovators and so forth. And it's not a heaven in any kind of a moralistic Christian sense, but it is the abode where it's understood what this life is about. It's that domain in the company of the aeon, sort of being in the court of the aeon, where you then are able to look back on this life and understand what all the struggle is about. And what it's about is creation. Okay, this world is a cauldron of creative genius, and that's why there needs to continue to be polemos. So I bring together that aspect of, Hermann Hesse's magic theater with Artaud's conception of a theater of cruelty, and I reflect on these characters in my novel Psychotron, where I first developed that fusion. I reflect on these characters like Dana Avalon and Nikita, these sort of very powerful feminine figures, as avatars of the kind of sorceress shaman that Medea was in, at the fountainhead of Iranian civilization in the era before Zarathustra. So we can also go into that if you want. This whole, history of the origin of the Magian order and my thoughts on the original form of Mithraism and how it relates to the cult of Prometheus, and in what way Medea is the central figure there. And
that was my next question, because Medea has always been one of my favorite archetypal images of the divine feminine, and I think she is, I think, the answer if you want to continue to restore where women should be, magic, pharmakia, everything. Even though most occult Wiccans they don't give her the press that she should get, but she's very powerful. She's and almost essential. But tell us about Medea.
So Medea was a princess and sorceress from basically what was then Sarmatia. She was from a place called Colchis, which in the geography of that time was Sarmatia, meaning the part of the Iranian Caucasus where the Amazons lived. The Amazons were, a Greek mythologization of these people who had a society that was, you could say, fairly matriarchal and certainly included women warriors. And there are some people who have argued, basically Georgian nationalists, because this place is in present day Georgia, that maybe Medea was Georgian in the sense of Georgians today and whatever. But back in those days, the people who are Georgians, no offense, I don't mean any offense by this, but back in those days, the people who speak the Georgian language today were peasants. And the people who ruled that area were Sarmatians. And we know that she was a royal, first of all, but then also, interestingly, when she has to, so basically Jason is this Greek hero who is aided by Medea as a sorceress in his journey from Greece to the Caucasus to seize this golden fleece and bring it back to Greece. And she gets romantically involved with him and has children with him. And then later, when they're back in Greece, I believe in Corinth, Jason decides that he should, after 10 years they've been together, maybe she's getting older, he decides that he should marry some local, Corinthian king's daughter, okay? So that their children, who are half foreigners by Medea, will have a better life there. I mean, this is the argument that he makes to her. She doesn't buy it, okay? Eventually she winds up killing him and both her children by him, murdering her children by him. And which, by the way, if you're coming from a patriarchal culture, that's rather unexpected behavior. A woman who was conditioned to accept, the authority of a male leader and so on and so forth would probably not behave in that way. She would have expected to have been treated that way, especially if she was a foreigner living in a foreign land. But she was a crazy Sarmatian woman. So she kills him and she kills his children, and then she has to flee back home. Well, it tells you everything that she flees to Iran. She goes to what was then called the Aryan kingdom, Aryana Khashatra, the kingdom of the Aryans. And Herodotus tells us that these people who call themselves Aryai, the Aryans, when Medea arrived there after she, had to flee Greece, she had such a deep impact on their culture through, among other things, establishing the order of the Magi, that these people, the Aryai, renamed themselves after her and started calling themselves Medians or Medes. So Medea, which is still the name for them in Persian, Medea are the Aryai renamed after Medea. Well, excuse me, but a Georgian peasant is not going to be accepted in the Median kingdom as such an important person that the entire Median people are going to name themselves after her and accept her form of sorcery, her cult, as essentially their national priesthood, which is what the order of the Magi becomes, to the point where by the time of Herodotus, the terms Magian and Mede are almost interchangeable. And then later, the Persians adopt this from the Medes because, the Medes were the older Iranian kingdom. And then Cyrus the Great has a Median mother and a Persian father. And he establishes the synthesis between the Persians and the Medes, which becomes the basis for the Iranian nation. So in any case, Medea was a Sarmatian sorceress princess who spent some time in Greece together with Jason, didn't end well, and then went back home, and home was Iran, and she established the order of the Magi there. Now, where it gets really interesting is that when you look at the sources about Medea, both Euripides' Medea and also Apollonius of Rhodes's Argonautica, the story about Jason and the Argonauts, and then also some references from historians like Herodotus and Thucydides. What you see is that on the one hand, this woman claims to be a priestess of Prometheus and that she is administering psychedelic substances to people in this cult, which are referred to as elixirs made from the blood of Prometheus. And there are various theories about what these substances were. Okay, so one of the scholars that I draw from is David Hillman, also known as Ammon Hillman. And another is Carl Ruck. And Ammon Hillman claims that the blood of Prometheus was wild saffron mixed with certain other things, including a purple dye that comes from a type of sea mollusk and viper venom, and that these were administered to adolescent girls that were intended to become what they called the Dracinae, the dragoness, priestesses of this cult. Now, here's where the Gorgon connection also comes in. Dragoness, right? So all the ancient sources tell us that the Scythians and the Sarmatians worshipped Gorgons. So the Gorgons, so feared by the Greeks, these snake-headed female deities, they were worshipped by Scythians and Sarmatians. And when you look into the ancient Greek sources, what they explain is that the snakes and the hair, this is all in Metapolemos, folks. So I introduced this, interestingly enough, in the chapter on epistemology, because I talk about how essentially witchcraft, including pharmakeia, including the administering of pharmacons, including psychedelic drugs, is the earliest form of techne. And techne is ontologically prior to episteme. Episteme, which is where we get the word epistemology from, theory of knowledge. Episteme, or knowledge, is derivative of and subordinate to techne. And it evolves from out of techne. So the earliest form of science is witchcraft. And pharmacology is part of that. And so that's why I introduced all this material in the chapter on epistemology. And then I very diabolically continue with it in the chapter on ethics. Anyway, so maybe I'll leave the readers to discover why. But in any case, there are these theories where Hillman suggests that, I was on about the Gorgons. So you look at the sources, and what they say is that but Hillman does talk about this, that the serpents in the hair are a symbolic rendition of the idea that viper venom was being mixed into this concoction together with the blood of Prometheus, wild saffron, and this purple colored extract from a sea mollusk, from a particular sea mollusk. And so these figures, the Gorgons, their serpents are symbolizing viper venom, and the idea that when you look at them, you turn to stone is the origin of this idea of getting stoned. Mm. Men turning to stone, it's like, what would happen to you if you don't respond well to the viper venom? Yeah. That was the idea. And the reason that the serpents are in the hair is because apparently the priestesses of Medea, the Draconi, the dragonesses, would rub this stuff into their hair to the point where their hair was so saturated by this compound that includes viper venom that they were able to take their arrows and rub it in their hair and then shoot them to kill people because the arrows became poison tipped. So remember, the Sarmatians and the Scythians, these northern Iranian people, were the best archers in world history. I mean, they were famous for archery, which is why Artemis, Artemisia, the principal deity of the Amazons, is an archer, is depicted always as an archer. So, and the Gorgons also are depicted sometimes in Greek mythology, holding bows and arrows. And so anyway, they would saturate their hair with this stuff and rub the tips of arrows in it, you know, to make poisoned arrows to use against their adversaries. So Ammon Hillman's interpretation is that it was wild saffron that was the blood of Prometheus mixed with this stuff. Carl Rook, who's also done a lot of research on ancient pharmacology, he thinks that it was Amanita muscaria. That when in the Greek sources, it describes Medea harvesting the blood of Prometheus as something that she's cutting from the earth, it's referring to Amanitas, and that these are metaphorically the droplets of the blood of Prometheus coming from where the eagle is piercing his side as he's chained in the Caucasus Mountains. Of course, the very place where Medea comes from. She comes from the place that Prometheus was chained, right? And so Ruck suggests it's Amanitas, and he basically develops this idea that the original form of Mithraism was an Amanita ingesting cult that involved an attempt to basically turn men into wolves. That looks so the wolf was the totem and standard of the most ancient Iranian people, the Scytho-Sarmatian people. They had two major totems. One was the wolf and one was the dragon. So remember, the dragon is priestesses of Medea. Well, the war banner of the Scythians was also a wolf. Mm-hmm. And Ruck has this idea that basically wolves would lead people to Amanita mushrooms, and that the consuming of these Amanitas would turn these people into berserkers, make them essentially wolfmen, and that the original form of Mithra was a wolf, that he was a lupine deity, and that this is why later on, Apollo and Mithra were syncretized by the Hellenistic people, because we also find that in the most archaic form of Greek religion, Apollo was depicted as a wolf. Mm. So, you know, what this suggests when you look at whether it's Ammon Hillman's interpretation of the pharmacology or Carl Rook's interpretation is that a woman who's explicitly identifying herself as a priestess of Prometheus, and who comes from the place in the Caucasus where Prometheus was chained, and who claims to be creating a pharmacon from the blood of Prometheus, is a woman who's originating the most primordial form of Mithraism and establishing the order of the Magi, which is the shamanistic priesthood of the most primordial form of Mithraism, which tells you what exactly? That Mithra is Prometheus, or rather that Prometheus is Mithra, which is something I've been saying in a lot of my work from the beginning, that if you look at the most ancient form of the Aryan pantheon, there's no Prometheus there, but there is a god of wisdom who's symbolized by fire. Long before Zarathustra develops this more philosophically abstract notion of Ahura Mazda, there is already a god of wisdom associated with fire who's a gift giver to humanity and a champion and savior of man. And that's Mithra. And this is why I think, as I've said before, Prometheus at Rockefeller Center is depicted as Mithra because the Rockefellers and other, elites who are into the occult know this. This is a secret that they've held for a long time, that really Prometheus is a sort of Greek face of the ancient Aryan deity Mithra.
Yeah, and of course the Statue of Liberty is the other giveaway. The secret society have known that, these are the same beings, and they've kind of worshipped it in plain sight, if you would, and it brings them power. Yeah. If you're going to side with Mithras, you're going to do very well in life, right, Jason? He will make you powerful.
Well, it's a good question. It's a good question. And it's one that I get into in this book. This book is divided into chapters that delineate the different dimensions of philosophy: ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and politics. And in the politics chapter, I get into what power really is, and what it means to really have power. And, is it really are politicians really the most powerful people? Is economic power the most, significant form of power? And ultimately, I argue that, power at the highest or deepest level is the capacity to have authorship over phenomena, to be able to sort of participate in the coding of the matrix is actually the greatest power. And I think ultimately that's the kind of power that's authorized phenomenally by the aeon, and that the other types of power in this world are very provisional and tactical, right? And, they're needed for the stage setting, but that's not what drives the story forward. That's not what drives the logos forward, the cosmic meta-narrative.
So it's even a step further higher than remembering Conan the Barbarian, Tulsa Doom. I was young and foolish with the riddle of steel, and he's like, I found something more powerful. And that famous scene where he goes, come here, come here. She jumps off. That's the power. He probably was looking even higher power, right? To control matter itself.
Now, this is great. You mentioned Tulsa Doom. You remember the snakes?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay, follow this for a second. This is going to get a little bit complicated, but try to hold on to this red thread.
I'm with you.
There's a figure in Iranian mythology called Zahak. Zahak is a later Persian, Middle Persian corruption of Ajidahaka. Ajidahaka, or Ejdaha, means the dragon. And this was a figure who, in ancient Iranian mythology, overthrows the king of the world, who ruled the world from an island continent at the center of the world, which froze over in a great apocalypse. And I've always argued that this is Antarctica, which is also Atlantis. So this king, Jamshid was Shah Jahan. He was the king of the world. And it said that when the apocalypse happened, Jamshid built vars on deep underground enclosures, like subterranean cities, for his people to survive the apocalypse. So this guy, the dragon, Ajidahaka, Zahak, defeats Jamshid. And he takes 3 of his daughters prisoner. And there's this one daughter Shahnaz. There are 3 daughters. One of them is named Shahnaz. And she lives with Zahak in the palace, right? And she's supposedly a prisoner who later, together with the other 2 daughters, is freed by a hero named Fereydun. And Fereydun marries this woman, and he has 3 sons by her. One of the 3 sons is Sarm, the patriarch of the Sarmatians. So the Sarmatians are named after this guy Sarm. And Sarm is the son of this Shahnaz by Fereydun. Fereydun frees her from supposedly from the clutches of Zahak, and he has this kid Sarm, and Sarm becomes the fountainhead for the Sarmatians. Now here, listen to this. So Zahak was a black magician, supposedly. From a Zoroastrian perspective, black magician. His snakes would feed on people's brains, and he had 2 chefs. And this is symbolic for saying that from a Zoroastrian perspective, Orthodox Zoroastrian perspective, he was corrupting people's minds. And that he had 2 chefs cooking the brains, right, for the snake, means that his message was it was diabolical in the literal Greek sense of diabolane. His message was sort of it was meant to create paradox, like Zen koans, to like expand your mind through creating a dialectical tension. That's what ultimately the 2 snakes and the 2 chefs represent. But the snakes also, interestingly, connect us back to the viper venom, the dragoness priestesses, Medea. Who is Medea? Medea is a Sarmatian royal sorceress. So if Sarm becomes the progenitor of the Sarmatian people, and then the Sarmatians are worshiping these dragoness priestesses, or rather the dragoness priestesses are the figures organizing their form of worship, their cult, right? And they are worshiping gorgons with these serpents in their hair. You think there might be any connection between Zahak with the 2 snakes coming out of his shoulders and the Sarmatian worship of gorgons and, you know, their dragoness priestesses? Of course.
Of course.
And this has been completely neglected in Iranian studies. As far as I'm aware, I'm the only person who's ever pointed this out. Because it's deeply controversial. What it suggests is that there was an earlier Iranian religion before Zoroastrianism, before the teachings of Zarathustra. It wasn't just a Mithraism that you can equate with the Roman form of Mithraism, this, you know, solar military cult that, you know, Mithraism was warped into in Rome. No, it was a darkly feminine form of Mithraism, which, among other things, included a worship of Mithra in feminine form. The Greeks themselves wrote in the time of Herodotus that the Iranians worship Mithra, and Mithra is their form of Aphrodite. They equated, you know, so they knew what, you know, any decent, you know, Iranian study scholar should know, which is that if you trace Mithra back to the oldest sources as Mithra Varuna, this deity had a feminine aspect and a masculine aspect, was hermaphroditic or androgynous. And in many cases was worshipped in its feminine aspect, which is why to this day in Iran, only women are named Mithra. Mithra is a feminine name in Iran exclusively to this day. So you have Mehr as a masculine form of it, but Mithra, specifically the ancient name, is only given to women. So the reason why nobody has, I think, really gone down this road before me in Iranian studies is that it reveals, it excavates a primordial, dark, feminine Iranian religion prior to Zoroastrianism, which is the original cult of the Iranian people, whose most important identifiable historical figure is Medea, the woman after whom the Median kingdom named itself. Okay? And this is the original form of the religion of Mithra and Prometheus, who is Mithra.
By Crom, that makes perfect sense. Good argument. Good argument. Yeah, I love it all. Indeed, I think you're 100% right. Why don't we pull up some super chats real quick? Graham, I'll pull them up. Do you have a question, or what do you think so far, Graham?
Oh, I got quite a few questions. I was going to say, it seems like what you're talking about with Mitra Varuna, the androgynous, sounds very similar to Zervan and Zervanism, which, given that was considered heretical in Zoroastrianism, perhaps the aversion to the idea of Mitra as androgynous could be tied into an aversion because of the Zervanism aspect of it.
Here's the connection. Let me try to lay this out as succinctly as possible. So originally you have this form of Mithra that I've described being worshipped, right? Then you have Zarathustra come in as a philosopher, which is really what he is. He's the first philosopher, and he thinks abstractly. He's like the first of the pre-Socratics.
Right.
And he develops this abstract idea of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Originally, he calls it Angreminu, and it's contracted later in Middle Persian into Ahriman. Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. These are two abstract principles. They later get turned into deities in a dualistic belief system, okay? The Mithraists are not satisfied with this, and in the Parthian period, they create a new form of Mithraism that incorporates and accommodates Zarathustra's theology, Zarathustra's theosophy, right? So that there is still Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, but they introduce this Zorvan, who was actually a very, there was a very ancient cult of Zorvan in Iran. You find evidence for it in Luristan, but these Parthian Mithraists brought back Zorvan in a myth where Ahura Mazda and Ahriman are twins born from out of this hermaphroditic Zorvan. And then Mithra is reframed as the mediator between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the kind of umpire who, signs shakes on a between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman on the terms of their conflict through cosmic history. But this mediator, Mithra, or Mehr in that Parthian Pahlavi language, is meant to ultimately reintegrate Ahura Mazda and Ahriman into the godhead of Zorvan. So Zorvan, what people call the Zorvanite heresy, whatever, it's kind of a corruption and a misunderstanding of a form of Mithraism where basically what's being expressed is the evolution of self-consciousness over history, where initially God, the deity, the Godhead, call it the Godhead. The Godhead is initially unconscious. And from out of the unconsciousness of the Godhead, Ahriman is actually born first, and the world is delivered over to Ahriman as the heir of Zorvan, the firstborn heir. And then Ahura Mazda is born second, the twin, the good twin. And it has to engage in a struggle with Ahriman, right? This struggle is mediated by Mithra and represents the increasing self-consciousness of the Godhead through the course of history, to the point where the Godhead becomes fully self-conscious and integrates its unconscious evil into its unconscious evil, its shadow. So the shadow of the God, right? And the whole mediator for this process is Mithra. So really, this is a sophisticated Parthian form of Mithraism that's bringing back this more holistic and integral, darker wisdom of Medea in a way that encompasses and incorporates Zoroastrian ideas. And the fundamental conflict that took place in the Sassanid period of Iran, which actually ultimately shattered Iran and rendered it vulnerable to the Islamic conquest, was precisely the conflict between this new, more sophisticated form of Mithraism, which the Mazdakites were advocating, and Orthodox Zoroastrianism. That was the basic dialectical struggle of Sassanid Iran.
No, thank you. That's I had some of the overview, but thank you for filling in a lot of the details there. One of the aspects that I find so fascinating about Zoroaster is, to the best of my research, he was the first one to have like an actual revealed religion, as opposed to much more of a traditional, chthonic growing up from the people sort of thing. And the other thing I wanted to comment is your explanation of Zervanism and the history there makes me wonder if there's any impact of Taoism, because I'm seeing a lot of, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman with the yin and yang, and Zervan being the Tao, and then you have the ultimately the synthesis of the two and the resolution with Mithra. That's sort of a pattern that I was extracting from what you were saying.
Those two remarks are excellent opportunities for me to really briefly go back into 2 points that I've made, I think, in prior conversations we've had, especially based on my book, Iranian Leviathan. So what I'm about to say is really truncated. Anyone wants the details, devils in the details, read Iranian Leviathan. So in response to your first point, I would categorically reject the characterization of Zarathustra as the bringer of a revealed religion or a prophet in the Abrahamic sense. Zarathustra's Gathas is a philosophical text. It belongs together with the fragments of Heraclitus or with the writings of Parmenides or the poem of Empedocles. Pre-Socratic philosophy was expressed poetically. It involves critical thinking and the development of abstract ideas, but expressed poetically. And Zarathustra is the first in that series of pre-Socratic thinkers. He wasn't the only Iranian, by the way. There was another Iranian pre-Socratic called Anacharsis of Scythia, who was much more of an anarchist than Zarathustra, and who is very similar in his thinking to Heraclitus, and who I think probably was an influence on Heraclitus and a bridge between Zarathustra and Heraclitus. Interesting thing about Anacharsis, the Scythian, is that the other person whose teachings are very similar to the lost writings of Anacharsis, which we have only in quotations, fragmentary quotations by other people, because thank you, Christians, for burning the Library of Alexandria. So the other interesting thing about Anacharsis is his teaching is very close to that of Gautama. And as I've argued in Iranian Leviathan, based on the research mainly done by Christopher Beckwith, his book Greek Buddha, Gautama Buddha is Lao Tzu. They're the same person. Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, is Gautama Buddha in his old age wandering in China. He was a Scythian, an Iranian. And the main purpose of Gautama Buddha's teaching was to critique the philosophy of Zarathustra. So in any case, the point is that we're dealing in these people, Gautama or Zarathustra, with philosophers. Zarathustra did not bring any religion. No religion, okay? He is not a religious prophet. A religion that we call here Zoroastrianism, which in Iran they call it Behtin, the good religion, was created later based on, I think, a misappropriation of the teachings of Zarathustra, and considering how much there is in the Gathas about the mumbling priests who deceive people together with the plundering princes, as he puts it, I think Zarathustra himself will be appalled to have seen the message of the Gathas turned into this religion of the Sassanid period, this Orthodox Zoroastrian state religion. In the Achaemenid period, under first of all, Cyrus doesn't say anything about Zarathustra at all. So there's no way Cyrus the Great was a Zoroastrian. I argue in Iranian Leviathan, he was definitely a Mithraist. But then even when you look at, Darius and Xerxes, who are putting in their inscriptions in the name of Ahura Mazda this and the name of Ahura Mazda that, right? And I've come to crush out, the liars and so on and so forth. They also invoke Mithra all the time. So they had some kind of a syncretic belief system that, represented an endurance of Mithraism combined with some ideas from Zarathustra. It was nothing like some Zoroastrian state religion. Zoroastrianism as a cult that compares itself to the Abrahamic religions and wants like a prophet who brought a revealed text where the Avesta is then framed as something like the Bible or the Quran. That's a creation of Ardashir Babakan, the founder of the Sassanid dynasty, together with his, cobwebbed mummified priesthood, the latter day so-called Magi, who are a disgrace to the Magi. They're better to call them Mobeds, which is the term they use for themselves anyway. And I think actually the order of the Magi, the real order of the Magi, which goes back to Medea, went to war against those people. And that's the occult history of Sassan and Iran, which sadly ended with the shattering of the country and the Islamic conquest.
Gotcha. No, thank you. Yeah, no, I knew that Darius was the first who brought Zoroastrian into the Persian Empire. So what you're saying is I got taken by the story of Zoroaster and his vision on the riverside and that whole origin of the religion, that was a later retrojection.
Definitely. These are late texts, later Avestan texts that are trying to frame Zarathustra as if he's something like Moses, and it's an abomination. And people also make these arguments because they think that somehow there's no identifiable hell realm in there's no identifiable dichotomy between heaven and hell in Judaism, in original Judaism, let's say in the ancient Israelite religion. And so they think that somehow Zoroastrianism imported the ideas of heaven and hell into Judaism, and then that became foundational for Christianity. But you look back at the teachings of Zarathustra, none of this shit is in there. Okay, this is all later Avestan interpolations and demonology that's being crafted through sort of appropriations of various Babylonian myths that are also the fountainhead for certain Israelite and biblical ideas. So it's a lot more complicated than to lump Zarathustra together with Moses and Jesus and Muhammad as the Baha'is do, which to me is their great sin. I mean, that's there's a lot of nice things to be said about Baha'is as people, but their theology is really fucked. I mean, the idea that you would put Zarathustra at the head of a prophetic lineage that includes Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, it's beyond repair.
It's classic perennialism. You know how they are. But yeah, let's get to some super chats. First, let's see. Thank you, Lyricus. Thank you for your support. Who do I else here? We got thanks for the support, Todd Klatt. Good to see you. The Virtual Insanity Hospital didn't want to release me. Sorry about that, but glad you made it. Yay, good to see Chester. It's been a while. I hope you're feeding the birds and chilling out. Ka. Great show, Jason, Graham, and Miguel. And then we do have a question, Jason. Thanks again. Thanks, V. John C.Y. Please ask Jason why we're limited to Kardashev 2 civilization. Is there no way beyond the data compounding limit? I refuse to believe we are trapped. Do you understand that, Jason?
Sure. First of all, I'm not saying that we're limited to. Okay, so Kardashev was a Soviet who came up with I say that because I can't in the moment remember whether he was Russian or Ukrainian. And Ukrainians get really pissed off, rightfully so, when you call their scientists Russian simply because they were contributing to Soviet science.
Right.
Kardashev was a Soviet scientist who came up with a scale of different hypothetical extraterrestrial civilizations that are relatively more and less advanced based on their level of energy usage. So he thought that a type 1 civilization is a civilization that has marshaled the energy resources of an entire planet. So we're approaching type 1. Type 2 is a solar system-wide civilization that has managed to tap the full energy resources of its sun, right, of its star. Type 3 civilization is an interstellar civilization, which has capacity to tap the energy of multiple stars. And the type 4 civilization is a galactic civilization. You get the idea, okay, right? So he developed this scale. In my book, Satanion, in the chapter called Catastrophic Information, which we had a show about this. People can go back and watch that show. I draw from the work of Rolf Landauer, John Archibald Wheeler, and Melvin Vopson, all physicists, to basically make this argument that not only are matter and energy forms of information, but if you start to look at the interchangeability of information with matter, you realize that the accumulation of data will ultimately have gravitational effects. That information, the form of matter that information is dark matter, which is not electromagnetically detectable, but it is supermassive. It can wind up having massive gravitational effects, which is how we detected dark matter to begin with, is its gravitational effect on the spin rate of galaxies and the bending of light from distant galaxies by galaxies that are closer to us. So anyway, I developed these ideas in that chapter, Catastrophic Information, ultimately come around to the conclusion that, number one, this suggests that it's more evidence that we're living in a simulation. And number two, and somewhat more disturbingly, it suggests that there's an informational ceiling to the simulation, that at a certain point, there will be a critical mass of data on our planet to where the amount of information we have in servers will weigh as much as the moon. And it will start to have massive gravitational effects on the planet that are geophysically cataclysmic. Okay? So what I suggest is that maybe what this is an informational ceiling. Now, what this fellow who's asking this question is implying is that, okay, well, maybe somehow, we could diversify the distribution of our information between Earth and Mars and the moon, and maybe we can build like some kind of arrays in space that are super dense, made of some kind of a metal alloy to like store information in servers there. But bottom line, even if we can transcend type 1 civilization, if the simulation works this way, there's no way we can get beyond type 2 civilization, because there would simply be too much data. And at that point, the simulation would crash or it would be reset by whoever's running it. And this person is saying, I refuse to believe that we're trapped in a system like that, right? Well, trapped is one, first of all, maybe the world runs that way. People often think, they take my work as if like I'm writing gospel truth or something. People, I'm a philosopher, okay? I explore many interesting ideas. It's an interesting idea, a disturbing idea. There's evidence that suggests it may be the case. Maybe it's not the case. But it's an interesting way to think about entropic limits and the battle against entropy on a cosmic scale, which is what I suggest in Satanion the Aeon is engaged in. That the Aeon is trying to extend her own life and the life of the cosmos by finding ways to work against entropy, by increasing order through promoting creation and innovation, and by trying to forestall the disintegration and decoherence of the cosmos. In other words, entropy and the death of the universe, right? So being trapped is one way to look at it. But how I frame it in Satanion is that the Aeon has created a simulation within her cosmos where she's grappling with the problem of entropy. She's created a bubble universe, a simulacrum that we're inside of, so that she can enlist the help of creative and super intelligent people within our world to solve the problem of entropy in her world. So it's like the 13th floor, right? Simulation within simulation within simulation. We're in a simulation that's inside of another quantum computational cosmos where this entity is grappling with the problem of entropy. So she's created a smaller pocket world that is helping her, probably in various ways, to wage this war to keep life and creation going. Now, when you frame that as being trapped, you are egotistically asserting your right to be considered the dominant and determinate form of life in the cosmos. which is an incredibly limited perspective, to think that your interests or our interests as the human race, Homo sapiens on this earth, are ultimately the highest priorities and what is, you know, of first rank and order in consideration for how this entire cosmos is run, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but look, human history and biological history are full of examples of lower forms of life being used for the purposes of higher forms of life. I mean, that's life, folks. Sorry to break it to you, okay? And if the motivation and purpose of this aeon is actually to fight against entropy by prolonging creativity and innovation, that's ultimately a worthy purpose. If you ask me, on aesthetic grounds, I think it's beautiful. And, you know, if humanity is being harvested and cultivated for the purpose of furthering and fostering that struggle, I don't see that as being trapped. It's not, to me, you know, the situation of a goldfish in a fishbowl.
Makes sense. And we have one last one from Ubaid. Thank you. As systems converge into cybernetics and singularity, does Metapolemos reflect the inner war of a full stack engineer striving for individuation?
As systems converge into cybernetics and singularity, does Metapolemos reflect the inner war of a full stack engineer striving for innovation?
No, I'm not sure either.
I'm not, just a little bit of a garbled formulation, that question there. Let me just respond to it in this way, that I think that the Metapolemos takes place on all levels. In other words, someone who's a coder and a hacker, whether that's in a literal sense or whether it's in a metaphorical sense of being a hacker of the matrix as an artist or a thinker,
right?
Someone who is on an individual level engaging in that kind of attempt to recode the matrix is as much engaging in the Metapolemos as, you know, the political structure of an entire society. The Metapolemos takes place on all levels, from the individual to the social to the metapolitical.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, on a quick side note, as we get towards the end, I wanted to share a story that I was I've read The Closer Encounters twice, but I was listening into the car, and I'm pick up my daughter, bring her home from ballet, and I'm listening to the part about child abduction portals. Remember that chapter, Jason? And yeah, it's heartbreaking. And I come in the house, I'm like tired. I sit there next to my wife, and she's on the news, and she goes, "God damn it! You hear that story about that kid in Arizona who disappeared, and they found him 7 miles away?" And she's like, "It cannot happen physically. A toddler cannot travel that much, and he was found." And I was like, boy, do I have a chapter of a book for you, Jace. And the synchronicity was, you know, the universe is always telling us, because I was meant to read and I was meant to tell my wife that. So,
you know, that's funny that, to speak of synchronicities, I was just discussing that with Nassim this morning. Exactly these cases of the people who go missing in national parks and then their bodies turn up like miles from where they were last seen, and like at altitudes, elevations, and locations they couldn't possibly have gotten themselves, you know. And the creepiest of the cases are these, where someone disappears for a while. All the resources are brought to bear to search for them. They can't be found anywhere in these national parks, right? And sometime later, they just show up. They wander out of the forest, right?
Yeah.
And then they tell you, you know, when I was in there was this other lost person that I came across. And so they describe the person, the clothes they're wearing, the age they're at, right? And then records are checked. And it turns out that the person that was described went missing in that forest 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Under the age they were when they went missing.
Right.
What is that? Is it the ghost of the person who died there? Maybe. I don't think so. I think there's some kind of a temporal vortex.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes, as you said, children go missing into these. And it's, you know, we live in which goes back to the point of my book. I mean, this is a harsh world we're living in, this Metapolemos. You know, try
Yeah. Portals can open. That's probably how Bigfoot goes in and out. And I'm like, God, if that kid test him, I bet they would find fibers from 100,000 or 1,000,000 years ago, right, Jason? But they won't test them. But I bet if they tested and they would find something out of time.
This is exactly how I think that those out of place artifacts wind up in geological strata that are
Right.
tens, in some cases, hundreds of millions of years old, where they find like a Roman coin in a geological strata 60 million years old. It's like, no, alien didn't put a Roman coin there, okay? An alien expedition didn't do that. That's some poor schmuck who went and, went through a time slip, went through a spatio-temporal vortex and wound up in that time and maybe got stuck there and left a Roman coin there.
Yeah. And your book go through so many of these. So kids, trust me, I like to go on long walks, Jason, and I always think of your book like, will this be the time, that I go for a walk and show up at 40 years later?
It makes life interesting in any case.
Awesome. And as we get to the end real quick, I always wanted to ask, since we talked about the Elvis book, what kind of music were you into when you were young or now, while you were seeing UFOs over Manhattan and having your mystical experiences and all that?
My musical taste has remained pretty consistent, from the age where I started, seriously, like listening to music. And King Crimson, definitely way up there, especially the album In the Court of the Crimson King.
My favorite.
And Jim Morrison, of course. Jim Morrison, all the classic Doors albums. And a lot of popular music. I don't know what it is, and maybe nostalgically resonate with a lot of the popular music from the 1980s, like Depeche Mode or something from the 80s. So those are the kinds of Western, modern musical tastes that I have. But then my oldest love in terms of music is actually Iranian music, which I listened to from childhood, and it's really bizarre. So I love both Persian classical music and Kurdish folk music. And my Persian family didn't really like this kind of music. It would be on every now and then. But they would play, when they played Persian music, they'd usually play Persian pop music, which I'm not as fond of. And I, as a 3-year-old, would be demanding that either Persian classical music like Mohammad Reza Jorjani or Parisa would be put on, or I'd be demanding to hear Kurdish folk music like Shahram Nazari or Ali Akbar Moradi. And they hated this stuff. They would put it on like just to, ingratiate me, so I wouldn't cause a fit. So it's very odd. That kind of music resonated with me from very early childhood. And I think there's a connection between that kind of Iranian music, both Persian and Kurdish, and stuff like King Crimson and Jim Morrison. They're both shamanic forms of music, I would say.
Oh yeah, easily.
Dionysian music.
Very much. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. It's good to know. For Jason, also too, for those of you who are listening to the audio version that will come out, Jason has a new Substack, so check it out. It's jasonrezajorjani.substack.com, and I will put it in the show notes, whether you're YouTube or you got on a podcatcher somewhere. So that's where you want to send people, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be publishing a lot of essays there. I'm going to go into a phase of essay writing for a while rather than book writing. And so people should check out my philosophical work at my Substack and, consider becoming a paid subscriber.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, we're at the end. Not much housekeeping. We will do our makeup show with Micah Dank next week. This might sound strange, but this is a strange world, but the I Ching was very firm. Usually the I Ching, when I do my daily readings, it's sort of, there's a little latitude and symbol, but it was like, oh my God. It told me to inform on my podcast that if there's anybody in Northern Illinois or Wisconsin that has some property or houses, to let us know. My family, we're in a crisis of moving and maybe getting kicked out. So usually the I Ching is like, we'll just wait this and wait. It was like, say it on your podcast. It was very, it was very strict. So I'm going to obey. So I am doing the bidding of the oracle and letting this out into the world. And yeah, that's it. As we get to the end, I appreciate the good crowd that was here today. I appreciate the support. Great show. But first, I'll say, Graham, thanks for keeping us company.
Oh, always a pleasure. And I want to thank Jason for educating me on some of the details there, and tell him to keep on pushing.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, Jason, as always, it's great to have you on. And yeah, look forward to your work. Look forward to joining your Substack. And yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very
both.
much.
Thank you both. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Always enjoy it, Jason. Keep doing what you're doing. We'll get there. We shall get there, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, as Julian of Norwich said. I believe it. But that is it. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And as I always say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Take care and enjoy